Many observers have focused on the immediate impact of Ukraine's recent strikes, but what's often overlooked is the systematic, years-long strategy behind these actions, fundamentally challenging Russia's long-held assumption that its annexation of Crimea was permanent and irreversible. For years, President Putin had built his Black Sea strategy on the belief that Crimea, seized in just 4 weeks in 2014, was a permanent acquisition. He envisioned the peninsula, which he famously called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, remaining under Russian control for generations. This conviction allowed him to transform Crimea into the instrument for two critical objectives in the region. First, achieving Black Sea dominance. Control of Crimea means control of the Black Sea, projecting power into the Mediterranean and access to surrounding energy resources. Second, dominating Ukraine's south. President Putin amassed troops, munitions, and equipment on the peninsula, using it as a launchpad to bombard Ukraine's southern regions. Crimea served both as an offensive base and a strategic supply line via the Kerch Bridge. President Putin's calculation was stark. As long as Ukraine remained weak, Crimea would remain Russia's forever. Ukraine, however, has shattered that calculation. This was not an overnight victory, but a surgical strategy meticulously executed over years. From 2022 onward, warships were sunk in Sevastopol, air defenses were systematically destroyed, and the Kerch Bridge was struck 3 times. In 2023, the Crab Trap operation targeted the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, killing more than 30 officers. Inside Crimea, partisan groups relayed critical intelligence, intensifying pressure to the point where Russia was forced to relocate the bulk of its fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Effectively withdrawing from the very peninsula it once boasted was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Now, in April and May of 2026, this strategy has entered its final, critical phase. Ukraine struck the Tuapse refinery 4 times in 16 days, severing the peninsula's primary fuel artery. It sank the last railway ferry. It destroyed 2 landing ships. It demolished ammunition depots along the land corridor. And it disabled Shadow Fleet tankers. These precision missiles and drones were fired directly at the lifelines of the peninsula President Putin once claimed was ours forever. 60,000 Russian troops are now left without adequate fuel. What retired U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges has asserted for years may now be turning into reality. Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war. The total liberation of Crimea may have begun. To understand the most critical move of this strategy, we must begin with Tuapse. This Rosneft-owned refinery boasted an annual crude oil processing capacity of approximately 12 million tons. It produced naphtha, diesel, fuel oil, and Euro 5 fuels, exporting them directly via tankers across the Black Sea. It was the main artery delivering fuel to Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet by the shortest sea route, the very lifeblood of President Putin's promise to sustain the peninsula. This refinery's strategic importance extends beyond its output. Its proximity to Crimea made it an irreplaceable logistical hub for Russian military operations, a vulnerability that Moscow seemingly underestimated despite its critical role in sustaining the Black Sea presence. On April 16th, 20th, and 28th, and finally May 1st, Ukraine launched attacks on the same refinery 4 times with surgical precision. The third strike provoked a rare reaction from President Putin himself. He claimed Ukraine's drone strikes were hitting civilian infrastructure. The irony was not lost on anyone, as Russia has relentlessly bombed Ukraine's power plants, thermal heating facilities, and civilian infrastructure throughout this war. This is where Ukraine's strategy diverged from Russia's. Ukraine was not striking civilian infrastructure. It was striking the oil that finances Russia's war. And at the foundation of that financing was Tuapse and Kyiv's strategic intent. In the final attack, the previously damaged pump station completely burned, disrupting internal transfer logistics at the facility. Satellite imagery confirmed that all 4 major storage tanks were destroyed. President Putin attempted to spin the situation in his favor. The Kremlin announced that the attacks were further aggravating the global oil shortage. Of course, Kyiv did not want to deepen a humanitarian crisis or escalate global markets. Ukraine's objective was clear: to limit Russia's oil export capacity and dry up the fuel source of the war machine. The Kremlin, in its own words, confirmed this objective. Tuapse is now completely offline, with production at zero. And the most shocking detail, all these attacks took place with almost no interception. Russia's S-400 batteries, Pantsir S-1 systems, and multi-layered air defenses on its southern coastline proved unable to stop Ukrainian drones. Tuapse collapsed. Air defense failed. This collapse was not an isolated event. Tuapse going offline has directly plunged Crimea into a severe fuel crisis. Tuapse's collapse was not merely a refinery loss, it was the severing of Crimea's lifeline. The peninsula possesses no oil refinery of its own, no indigenous production. More than 90% of the 2.5 million strong peninsula's fuel needs came from the Russian mainland via the Kerch Strait. The heart of these shipments was the Tuapse and Novorossiysk refineries. Processed fuel was then transported by tankers to Kerch, Feodosia, and Sevastopol. The complete failure of Russia's advanced air defense systems to protect such a critical strategic asset is highly unusual, especially given the repeated nature of the strikes. This suggests either a severe degradation of Russian air defense capabilities or a fundamental flaw in their deployment strategy against persistent drone attacks. Tuapse was the most critical link in this chain because it was the closest, offered the fastest route, and met a significant portion of the Black Sea Fleet's fuel needs. That link has now been broken. Crimea's fuel crises are not new, but this time the scale may be far larger. Even before Tuapse collapsed, in late 2025 and March 2026, serious fuel shortages had already occurred across Crimea. In Simferopol, Yalta, Alushta, and other eastern regions, AI-95 gasoline and diesel were unavailable at many stations. Signs displayed none warnings for themselves, but also none by 9 and quit level. Reports revealed that on the black market, gasoline was being sold at exorbitant prices from the backs of trucks, and at that time, Tuapse was still operating. Now, Tuapse is offline. The Feodosia depot has been struck, and tankers are out of service. These scenes were happening even when the main artery was functioning. It is not difficult to calculate the catastrophic scale of the crisis once that artery is completely severed. But the real catastrophe unfolds on the military side, and its scale is massive. An estimated 60,000 or more Russian troops are stationed in Crimea. This force creates an enormous fuel demand for its tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and helicopters. Every drop these troops need, diesel, jet fuel, mazout, comes from the Russian mainland. Ukraine targeted precisely these arteries. The strike on the Feodosia fuel depot created a particularly serious impact. This depot was one of the main lines pumping fuel to units on the southern front. The Kerch Bridge had been damaged in previous attacks and is not being used for heavy military transport. The last railway ferry had also been neutralized. According to the Russian partisan movement Atesh's April 29th statement, Russian forces in southern Ukraine are facing a growing fuel crisis. A Russian soldier summarized the situation clearly. Equipment is standing still. We're going nowhere. Commanders ordered strict rationing. They say fuel will come, but nobody knows when. Logistics experts estimate that vehicle fuel capacity on the southern front could decrease by 20 to 30%. This means shortened range for armored vehicles, an inability to change defensive positions, and slowed evacuation operations. The Black Sea Fleet is also severely affected. Resupply infrastructure at Sevastopol and Feodosia has been damaged. On May 3rd, President Zelensky escalated the situation one step further. He struck 2 tankers belonging to Russia's Shadow oil fleet with naval drones at the Novorossiysk port entrance. In President Zelensky's words, Ukraine's long-range capabilities will continue to be comprehensively developed at sea, in the air, and on land. Tuapse is offline. The Feodosia depot has been struck. 2 Shadow Fleet tankers are out of service. The last Kerch ferry has been neutralized. Novorossiysk is not safe either. In March 2026, Ukraine struck this port with more than 200 drones and sank the minesweeper Valentin Pikul. Every artery feeding Crimea is being cut one by one. But cutting fuel lines is only one dimension of this unfolding picture. Ukraine is simultaneously and systematically destroying every military supply route reaching Crimea. On the night of April 5th, Ukrainian Defense Intelligence confirmed that the last railway ferry operating in the Kerch Strait, the Slavyanin, was disabled by drones. These ferries were carrying military equipment and ammunition to Russian forces in Crimea over water. Now, all these vessels have been destroyed or disabled. On April 20th, Ukrainian forces struck two large Russian landing ships stationed in Sevastopol Bay. Project 775 Yamal had a capacity to carry up to 500 tons of armored vehicles and troops. The 1,171 Nikolai Filchenkov was even larger, with its 1,000-ton capacity. During a week-long campaign in April, 3 ammunition depots, 3 supply warehouses, and 2 logistics centers were struck along the critical land corridor connecting Russia to Crimea. Junction points coordinating material flow were disabled one by one. The last railway ferry neutralized. 2 major landing ships struck. Ammunition depots and warehouses demolished. The land corridor is under constant pressure. The Kerch Bridge, damaged in previous attacks, is not being used for heavy transport. Retired Lieutenant General Hodges speaks definitively about this bridge. That big bridge will eventually be destroyed. The Kremlin's commanders may attempt to redirect supply through Kherson via Donbass, but these routes are much closer to the front line. Kyiv's drones are in the air at all times. Detecting and striking any convoy heading to Crimea is merely a matter of time. Crimea is being systematically isolated from sea, land, and rail. The consequences of this isolation are not only military. The environmental impact is also shaking the peninsula. Tuapse was once part of the shining coastal strips of the Russian Riviera. Every summer, hundreds of thousands of Russians came here for vacation, but now its beaches are covered in black petroleum. Ecologists estimate that 300 to 350 tons of petroleum products have mixed into the sea and soil. Satellite imagery detected an oil slick 7 kilometers long. The spill is moving northward. The resort towns of Agoy, Nebug, and Olginka are at risk. Smoke has reached Sochi and Anapa, and the edge of the oil slick is just 30 kilometers from President Putin's palace at Cape Idokopas. Novichok nerve agent developer Vil Mirzayanov warned these fumes are not harmless. They carry death in the form of polyaromatic compounds. Krasnodar Governor Kondratiev characterized the Tuapse fires as local flare-ups and even invited tourists to visit the region. The regime's attitude toward its own people, downplaying fires, denying health risks, ignoring the environmental catastrophe, forms another dimension of Crimea's isolation. Russia cannot protect its own Black Sea coastline, and this collapse is also directly affecting Russia's oil export capacity. Tuapse may be a single refinery, but its collapse has exposed the cracks in Russia's oil empire. Russia's refinery output has dropped to 4.7 million barrels per day, the lowest level in 17 years. Refined product exports, including diesel and fuel oil, have shown a sharp decline. According to the Wall Street Journal's analysis, Ukraine's attacks are effectively consuming the revenues earned from high oil prices. In one expert's analogy, it's like winning the lottery while your car is being systematically blown up on the way home. And alternative routes have their limits. Tuapse, Primorsk, Luga, Novorossiysk, all these ports are now within Ukraine's range. In 2022, Ukraine's long-range weapons could reach 650 kilometers. By 2026, this range has increased to 1,750 kilometers, nearly tripled. When Russia protects one port, Ukraine strikes another. This cat-and-mouse game is depleting Russia's air defense resources. Russia continues to lose 40 to 50 critical air defense units every month. Frontline offensives have slowed to their lowest pace in recent years, in some sectors completely stopping, while in others, Ukraine is pushing back. Tens of thousands of soldiers are killed or seriously wounded every month. Recruitment figures are falling while thousands desert. February 2026 marked a massive turning point on the front. Ukrainian forces, for the first time since 2023, are now encountering more territory than they lost. And with Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán's April 12th election defeat, President Putin lost one of his only allies within NATO and the European Union. The last obstacle to Ukraine receiving a €90 billion credit from the EU was also removed. One detail clearly shows how serious the situation is for the Kremlin: no tanks at the approaching May 9th Victory Day parade. Normally, armored vehicles and nuclear weapons are displayed on Red Square, one of the biggest symbols of Russia's military power. This year, the Kremlin cancelled the armored convoys. President Putin's traditional show of strength may have actually turned into the most open admission of weakness. The absence of tanks from the Victory Day parade is an unprecedented symbolic concession, far beyond typical logistical adjustments. This public display of military restraint on a day meant to project power suggests a profound internal assessment of resource scarcity and operational limitations, signaling weakness to both domestic and international audiences. China, Iran, and North Korea are observing Russia's fragility in the Black Sea. Russia's inability to protect its own oil infrastructure may be causing these countries to question the returns on their support for Moscow. China is providing breathing room through energy purchases, but is calculating the risk of an unstable ally a little more each day. Russia's weakness is making Beijing the dominant partner in the alliance. And Moscow knows this, but may no longer have the power to prevent it. This entire picture, Tuapse's collapse, Crimea's fuel crisis, the systematic destruction of supply routes, eroding air defense, a stalled front, and the inability to even display tanks on Victory Day, points to a single, inescapable conclusion. President Putin, in 2014, described Crimea as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. That aircraft carrier's fuel lines have now been cut, its supply routes destroyed, its defenses collapsed, and its coastlines covered in black petroleum. In Lieutenant General Hodges' words, Crimea is the decisive terrain of the war, and Hodges speaks clearly about the Kerch Bridge as well. That big bridge will eventually be destroyed. All the pieces now appear to be in place. Ukraine is isolating Crimea step by step with surgical precision. The total liberation of Crimea may indeed have begun. With 4 strikes in 16 days, Tuapse collapsed. The Feodosia depot was struck. The last railway ferry was sunk. 2 landing ships were destroyed. Ammunition depots along a land corridor were demolished. Shadow Fleet tankers were disabled. 60,000 Russian troops are left without fuel. The Kerch Bridge's days are numbered. Not even tanks can cross Red Square. And President Zelensky's words are ringing in the Kremlin's ears. Ukraine's long-range capabilities will continue to be developed at sea, in the air, and on land. President Putin, in 2014, thought he had secured Crimea as part of Russia for generations to come. Now he is learning how badly he was wrong. Crimea is returning.